everyone, to the May 13, 2021 meeting of the Town of Cumberland Board of Adjustment and Appeals. Before we begin the meeting, I'd like to ask the board members to introduce themselves, beginning on my far left.
Yes, Christian Lewis.
Sally Pierce.
Andrew Black.
And I'm Matt Manahan.
Peter Lacey.
Ron Cobb.
So we do have a quorum tonight, and we have 3 items on the agenda. Oh, and I guess normally we do ask Mr. Longley and Ms. Silberman to introduce themselves. So why don't we do that? So you're not at the head table anymore, but.
I'm Christina Silberman.
And Bill Longley, Code Enforcement Officer.
Thank you. So the first item of business, it's been so long since we last met, is the election of a chairman and a clerk per the Town of Cumberland zoning ordinance, Chapter 315-77A1. I think our last meeting was in November of 2019, so it's been a while. Does anyone have any nominations? Does anyone want to, would anyone like to, would anyone be willing, I guess I should say, to take my place in this spot as chair?
I don't think anyone would take your place, and I would certainly nominate you to be the chair again, so I would move to nominate
I would
Matt
second that
Manahan
nomination.
to be the chair.
If you're so willing.
Sure, I'm willing. Maybe next time we can find a replacement for me. But I haven't had much work to do in the last year, so I gotta earn my pay here tonight. So, all right. So we have a nomination for me to serve as chair, and I think I heard a second. All those in favor? And I abstain. Thank you. And Christina, I think you are currently our clerk, technically, right?
Yeah.
Are you willing to do that, continue to do that job?
I believe it is part of my job description, so, yes.
Good. Well, that's a good thing then. Does anyone want to nominate Christina Silberman to be our clerk?
I would be happy to nominate Christina Silberman to be our clerk.
Second.
It's a nomination and a second. All those in favor, raise your hand. It's unanimous. Thank you and congratulations. Okay, our second item of business tonight is a public hearing, an interpretation decision appeal in the name of Caleb King of 28 Shirley Lane in Cumberland, who has submitted an appeal of the Assessor Addressing Officer John Brushwein's decision that was upheld by the Code Enforcement Officer William Longley to deny Mr. King's request for a street name to serve a lot located off Middle Road, Tax Assessor Map R01, Lot 49C. This is an appeal under Section 246-8 of the Town of Cumberland zoning ordinance. Mr. Longley, do you have an introduction to give to us of this matter?
I don't have an introduction. We do have the addressing officer, John Brushwein, is here to give testimony. And I think your normal procedure is to let the appellant give their side first, and then we will answer any questions, or John will provide his brief statements afterwards.
Fair enough. Okay, Mr. King, would you approach the podium so that we can pick you up on both audio and video? And maybe if you could introduce your appeal and tell us why it is you want us to reverse the decision of the CEO and the assessor addressing officer.
Absolutely. Let's see if this comes up. There we go. Good evening, everyone. As you're all aware by now, my name is Caleb King. I'm currently a resident of 28 Shirley Lane in Cumberland. My wife and I are building a home on our lot on the east end of Middle Road, land that's been owned by my family for more than 80 years. I just want to start by thanking all the members of the board as well as the town staff for coming out, taking time out of their schedules away from their families to address this issue. I will try and be as precise and concise as possible. I also want to state I don't have any personal qualms or vendettas against the town. Mr. Shane, Mr. Longley, and all the other town staff members have been helpful through the whole permitting process. But that's not to say the entire process has been easy, and I would be lying if I said it has not been frustrating. I never originally wanted to have a private street. I would have simply liked a driveway off from Middle Road, but due to the configuration of my lot, a private street is required per the code, which is what brings us here tonight. One of the final steps in the process in creating a private road or street is naming that said private road or street. The proposed street name originates from my cattle company, Deep Creek Cattle Co., which my family and I started last year. Like many during the pandemic, we were looking for something to do that was fulfilling as well as rewarding. My family has a long storied history of farming on Middle Road that goes back 4 generations. There are still fence insulators and trees that are older than I am around there. Over the past year, we have acquired and sold beef cattle, trained steers, and became the only ABBI registered breeder in all of New England. The next closest is in New York. Beyond that, my family members, who I will share the road with, have discussed several names and agreed that our primary choice is Deep Creek Drive. And just to clarify on the sheet, I put Pine Ridge simply to fill out the paperwork, act as a placeholder. I've never really intended to name it anything other than Deep Creek Drive. I am not here to dispute what Code 246-4B states, but I am here to dispute the subjective interpretation of a proposed street name as it relates to the code. As you can see in the code, there are 3 criteria for naming a private road, which my proposed street name meets all 3 of. One of them being no 2 streets shall be given the same name. There are no other Deep Creek Lanes, Deep Creek Ways, or Deep Creek Roads in the town of Cumberland. There is, however, one road that shares the word creek in its name, which is Woody Creek Lane off from Route 9. The other part is no 2 streets shall have similar sounding names. Linguistically and phonetically, Woody and Deep are in fact very dissimilar. They share a single consonant. Phonetically, they do not rhyme, like beach or peach as provided in the code example. And lane and drive share a single vowel, a silent E, and are also phonetically not similar. And the final part being the road will have the same name for the entire length, which it will. I do understand they share the word creek, but since the ordinance was passed, that has not stopped other individuals or developers from naming new streets that share words with other existing words in town. This slide is an example of roads in Cumberland that share the word ridge. As you can see on the slide, after the adoption of the ordinance, which was originally adopted in 1998, updated in 2003, there have been 8 roads that have been placed in town with the word ridge in them, and a total of 18 that share the word ridge. Other glaring examples of roads that have been named similarly since the adoption of the ordinance include Goose Ledge Road, which was named in 2011, and York Ledge Drive in 2005, which both share the word ledge in their name and are located in the same Thomas Drive subdivision off from Route 1. Torrey Pine, which I believe was put in 2010, which is also in the Thomas Drive subdivision, shares a word with Pine Lane, Pine Ridge, Tall Pines Way, Whispering Pines Way, etc. Castle Rock in West Cumberland, which the town owns a piece of property abutting and addressed off from, sounds very similar to Channel Rock off from Route 88. Now, creeks, ledges, rocks, and ridges are all geographical terms. I do not think the town can say they are holding a standard when they allow multiple uses of one landform, but they don't allow duplicates of another. Another issue raised by the town regarding Deep Creek Drive is the concern that emergency services may have difficulty in locating the property, or it may cause confusion with other addresses. But I certainly have more faith that the individuals who serve or volunteer for our fire, EMS, and police departments will be able to figure it out. Since the appeal process began, I have spoken with several respected members of both the police department and the fire department to get a better understanding of how emergency calls are dispatched, and if I'm incorrect in any of this, please feel free to lend more insight. But when a call comes in, the responding department is given an address, and 2 cross or reference streets are given as well. So for example, when my grandfather needed an ambulance, the call came through as 51 Middle Road. Cross streets are Shirley Lane and Range Way. Deep Creek Drive would be referenced with Middle Road and Range Way, while Woody Creek Lane is likely referenced with Longwoods Road and Sullivan Drive. It was also described to me that many of the newer computers and software systems in the cruisers or fire vehicles provide directions to the address real time. So if Cumberland doesn't have them, I'm sure we will get them shortly. And the entire E911 system is designed to avoid confusion. And understand that mistakes do happen, as outlined by Chief Small in his memo, with Middle Road and Mill Road, but those names are phonetically much closer than Deep Creek Drive and Woody Creek Lane. Let us also not ignore the fact that many of the police department live in town, while the fire department is made up of volunteers, many of whom have lived here their entire lives. I think it is safe to say that they are a capable group that knows their way around town. My hope in this meeting is to allow common sense to prevail on this issue. I understand Mr. Brushwein made a decision based on his interpretation of the code, but it is just that, an individual's interpretation. I am not looking to be an exception to the code. I am simply looking to be treated the same as others that I provided examples of have been treated under the same code. I have lived in Cumberland for my entire 28 years of life, and I will live here until I die, which is the whole reason I'm putting up a fight about naming the private street the name that I want. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. King. Any questions for Mr. King before he sits down?
My cousin and neighbor Tanner would also like to speak. I don't know when that comes in.
Why don't we're gonna open it up to public comment in a few minutes.
Okay, great.
Why don't we have him speak then,
Sounds good.
and anyone else in the audience also can speak. No questions for Mr. King? Okay, go ahead and sit down. Ms. Brushwein, do you want to respond?
I'm John Brushwein. I'm the tax assessor and also the addressing officer. I became the addressing officer in 2017. Prior to that time, the town manager was the addressing officer. So I can't really speak to names that were approved prior to that date that may or may not be similar to existing names. I will say that in 1998, when this came into effect, there were a lot of towns that had similar sounding names. The state wanted towns and municipalities to change those, but there was significant pushback in most towns. At the time, I was working for the town of Mount Desert. They had numerous names that were similar, and due to the pushback, the town voted not to change those names and in effect grandfather those similar sounding names. So the process in the town of Cumberland with regards to road naming is that an application is filled out and submitted to me as addressing officer. It typically, I would send out an email to the police chief and the fire chief, who I defer to, the town manager, the code enforcement officer, and the planner, indicating what the proposed names were to see if there was any conflict. In the case of Mr. King, I got an email from, and so did Christina Silberman, with the application. To be honest, I didn't look at it the day it came in. I'm in the process of trying to get my assessments up to date for the upcoming tax commitment. So it was 6 days, and Christina asked me if I had responded to Mr. King, and I said, no, I haven't. I'll take a look at it. I opened the email, looked at the 3 names, and in the past, since I have been here, anytime there was a name that was similar or had a portion of the name in it, it has been denied. So I saw Deep Creek Drive, Deep Creek Lane. I knew there was a Woody Creek, and then the other one was Pine Brook, and I knew there was a couple of Pines and a Brook Road and a Brookside Road. So in this particular instance, since I knew based on past, that there probably would be a conflict. I called the police chief, indicated what the proposed names were. He said no. He said that's going to be conflicting. I would recommend against it. I then tried to contact the fire chief. He was on vacation during that week. This was the week of the 21st of April. So I went down and actually talked to the town manager because he was the addressing officer prior to my taking over. And he also indicated no. At that time, I sent Mr. King an email saying that those names were unacceptable and that I asked him to propose 3 new names, and I also included a copy of all the names in the town so that he could choose a name that was dissimilar. Mr. King responded, obviously, saying that he wanted to appeal. At that point, he wanted to do whatever it took, meaning whether it was going to the planning board, the town manager, the town's attorney. And to be honest with you, when I got the email, I was a little taken aback, I was a little surprised, and I actually I didn't even know what the next step was. I had to look at the ordinance to find out that, in fact, there was an appeal process. At that point, I contacted Bill Longley and went in and sat down with him, told him what the situation was. Bill said that he would contact Mr. King, tell him about the appeal process, and here we are. Subsequently, I got a statement from the police chief just confirming the discussion we had had. When the fire chief got back from his vacation, I talked to him about it and asked him if he wanted to submit something, and he did, which you have.
Okay, thank you. Just so I'm clear, your memo was helpful, and thank you for that. You cite the 2 of the 3 provisions that Mr. King cited from the ordinance. One was no streets shall be given the same name, e.g. no Pine Road and no Pine Lane. So there, obviously pine is the same word. 2 is no 2 streets should have similar sounding names, e.g. Beach Street and Peach Street. So are you thinking that, and is the police chief thinking that the word creek is the same? Is that the basis, or is it more that woody and deep, if they're being said quickly in a 911 call, would be similar sounding enough so that there could be confusion, or is it both?
I think, and speaking for myself, I think it's past decisions have been if it contained a word, in this case, creek. When you're in an emergency situation, people are excited. It's not always clear when it goes over the radio. In some cases, there are handhelds that are being used, and there can be mix-ups, as was indicated in the memo from both the police chief and the fire chief. And as I said, I defer to them in any case of road naming. So that, in answer to your question, I believe it's the creek portion of it, because there is already a woody creek.
I'm just trying to think I mean, the police chief and the fire chief are more expert on this, obviously, but I'm just thinking as a practical matter, if someone is obviously scared or nervous or hurt or something, and they're speaking quickly, you wouldn't think that woody and deep might be confused, certainly creek. It sounds like what you're saying, the word creek. Mr. King cites numerous other streets that are, like the word ledge is in many of them. Are you just thinking we shouldn't make that same mistake again, basically?
Yes. I think that when this came into effect, and again, I can't speak to the names that he cited because it was prior to my being here. I don't know what the decision process was that took place. But I know that I've been an assessor for 35 years, and since 1998, in the municipalities I've worked for, I've been the addressing officer, and we have tried to make sure that names were as dissimilar as possible when we were having new road names.
Yeah. Other questions?
So, yes, thank you. So, if any name came to your office with the word creek in it, would you deny it no matter what the other names were?
I would obviously go through the process with the police chief and the fire chief, and I would say, yes, it probably would be.
But normally, you get to decide whether a name is appropriate or not, and then you can ask for assistance from the fire and police chief. Is that
No,
correct?
that's not the case. The case is that I send it out to the people involved. It's supposed to, if you look at the ordinance, it's the police chief and the planning department that really making the decision. But the process that has been taken here is the people that I informed you of, the code enforcement officer, police chief, fire chief, the planner. Did I leave anybody else?
Manager.
And the town manager, right.
Okay, so if any name came into your office with the word ridge or creek or pine in it, what would you do?
Today, I would say, well, I'd send it out, as I said, but I would assume that based on practice that since I have been here, it would probably be denied.
When you say send it out, you'd send it out to the police chief, the fire chief, and
Correct.
ask them what they think. but you-
Correct.
Okay. Yeah.
Those are the people that are gonna be responding, so those are the people that I defer to. I don't make the decision.
Other questions? Yep.
Can you clarify, because the memo talks about Woody Creek Drive as being a conflict? Is it Woody Creek Lane or Woody Creek
It's
Drive?
drive.
The map says lane. The
I see,
memos
okay.
say drive from the fire chief
My
and the police
system's
chief.
drive. Okay. Okay.
So it is Woody Creek Lane?
No, it's what you're asking for in any case.
So Woody Creek Lane is, I think, the existing road
Existing.
Oh,
was
I'm
saying
sorry.
right now.
I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. Got it.
the memo from the fire department and the,
Woody Creek Lane is the current and Deep Creek Drive is the proposed.
correct. But the memos from the fire department and the police chief talk about Woody Creek Drive.
Got it. Other questions?
Do you know offhand how long the current police chief and fire chief have held their positions?
I
Ms.
know the police chief started here when I did, and I've been here almost 5 years and about 2 weeks. And Dan's been fire chief for quite a while, even before me.
I don't even know.
And do you know if the process was the same as it is now, before you were here, about referring it over to them for their comments?
Yes, as far as I know, because when I was appointed to the position, that is how I was informed that the road naming approval process went.
And you saw the list of names that Mr. King put up there on the prior names and the conflicts and so forth. Do you have any reason to believe that any of that is inaccurate?
No.
And were there any names listed on there that were ones that you were involved in naming?
No. And one thing I would add is, and I, personally, doesn't matter to me what the name is, other than I have an ordinance to follow. But with respect to the system that the emergency departments use to go to a call, we just had one just recently, which was in Cumberland Crossing, right across the street from the town office, and the fire department didn't know where they were going. They actually went to Crossing Brook Road. So it's not like it's going to be exact based on the existing system.
Other questions for Mr. Brushwein? If not, thank you, Ms. Brushwein, appreciate it. Would anyone from the public like to speak in favor of the appeal that is supporting Mr. King? Yes, sir. Please approach the microphone and state your name.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tanner Story. As Caleb mentioned earlier, I'm his neighbor. I live at 57 Middle Road, and I'm also his cousin. Before I begin, I also want to echo Caleb's thanks to the board members for being here today, taking time out of your schedules. I'm very thankful that such a process exists for us to voice our concerns and to appeal to reason. I first want to, my first point was actually to point out, as Board Member Lacey did, I believe that's his name, assuming the plaques are correct.
Yes, that
Great.
is Mr.
Thanks.
Lacy.
Thank you. That both Chief Rumsey and Chief Small made a mistake in there when evaluating the preferred street name according to the emails. I can't speak to the phone call that was had beforehand, but the email represented suggesting denial due to similarity referenced Woody Creek Drive and that is not the name of a road in Cumberland. It's Woody Creek Lane. And the proposed name that Caleb has is Deep Creek Drive. There cannot be a less confusing sounding pair of two names, and I would challenge anyone here to create a rhyme out of those two sets of street names. So if we're deferring to Chief Rumsey and Chief Small, I think they should be made aware, at least, of maybe their misunderstanding, so that they can reevaluate the preferred name against the existing street names. So the ordinance says, and this is my interpretation of the ordinance, so I've read it very carefully, and there are really two parts that come into question, as has already been pointed out. One is, number one is that no two streets shall be given the same name, and the example given says Pine Road and Pine Lane. The road prefix, the street name prefix in that example is exactly equal, and the road suffix is different. That is not the case with Caleb's proposed name of Deep Creek Drive when compared to Woody Creek Lane. The word deep and woody are different. The second part is that no two streets should have similar sounding names. And as I said before, I would challenge anyone to create a rhyme that uses those two streets as a rhyming mechanism. I've worked with Caleb really closely throughout this process and throughout his journey, and he's always been really exceedingly patient when working with the town. And he's been trying to get this road approved for really quite some time now. I think it's been over a year. And has gone through all of the proper channels and followed all the rules, and worked really closely with the town to try and get it done. There's been paperwork, lawyers, appraisals, an ordinance change already, but Caleb stuck with it, and throughout the whole process since the beginning, it's been Deep Creek Drive. And then I heard the town had denied the name Deep Creek Drive, and I really wasn't that surprised. I thought it was pretty typical of what Caleb has had to go throughout this process. That's the end of my commentary, but again, I want to thank the board, and I really hope that you take these points into consideration and make a reasonable call here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. King. Any questions for Mr. King before he sits down?
Mr. Story.
I'm sorry, Mr.
Okay.
Story. Mr. Story, just one thing here.
Yes.
You asked if there's or you challenged us to come up with a rhyme, and
You tuned out after that, didn't you?
right, exactly. I've been
Wheels are
thinking about it.
turning.
Right. Well, frankly, because I'm thinking about if I'm calling 911 and I'm drunk, or which sometimes happens, and I don't usually call 911 then, hopefully, but if there's a cutout, I'm thinking if someone says Deep Creek,
Yep.
or versus someone says Woody Creek, there's two E sounds before the word creek. If the wood part gets muffled, I guess I'm struggling with
You're
the
omitting
safety.
you're
I'm
omitting-
struggling with the safety concern
Yep.
here that Mr. Brushwein and the police chief and
I
the fire
understand.
chief are concerned about, versus the desire of the applicant,
Yep.
of the appellant, to have a name that's part of his business. And I'm struggling a little bit with whether there is a rhyme in certain circumstances that could be
Yep.
made.
I would argue that you omitted the suffix, and if the only word that someone heard when trying to hear an address is creek, I would really hope that someone would ask for clarification, because creek is a body of water. You could be in any of those, and I would really hope that if there is some sort of cutout and they hear lane or drive, if they hear Creek Drive or Creek Lane, you still have the road suffix to lean on.
Well, as long as they weren't cut off, right? I mean, sometimes, you know, there
you're
could be,
right,
there
yep.
could be a reception issue
Yep.
or whatever. But
You're-
yeah, no,
You're correct, but if they're cut off, I would really hope that if the only word that someone heard, if they were cut off sufficiently enough such that they couldn't hear the beginning, the first word of the road prefix and the road suffix, that they would ask for clarification, because the only remaining word is creek. And that is, you know, it would be in reference to many more bodies of water than it would the two road names.
okay, yeah, thank you, appreciate your response. Yeah, just one second, Mr. Black has a
Yes,
question.
One question,
Sorry,
Mr.
yeah.
Story, and I'm not trying to be snarky here, but have you ever worked as a dispatcher for a 911?
No, sir.
Okay,
No, sir, I have not.
all right, thank you.
No, it looks like no other questions, so thank you very much. Would anyone else from the public like to speak in favor of this appeal, in support of the appeal? If you could just state your name for the record.
I
thank-
am Jack Kane. I am Caleb's cousin, business partner. I also stood up to speak to the point that Mr. Brushwein brought up about the recent fire call at Cumberland Crossing. I'm also a volunteer firefighter, and the confusion, I just wanted to clarify that. The only reason I'm standing up, the confusion from that is because those are not, those roads in the new subdivision, brand new subdivision, hardly a year old, are not in the GPS system yet. So they're not in the fire department's GPS system. If you Googled any of them on your phone, I do not believe you get results yet for them. So I just wanted to stand up and make that clarification. Why, when someone said crossing, that's why they went to Crossing Brook. It had nothing to do with the phonetically sounding system. That's all I,
Okay.
any questions?
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. King?
Tell them how that works, that we get a notification and have one and get a map.
Does anyone else from the public want to speak in favor of the application? Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is John Kane. I am Caleb's uncle. I live at 53 Middle Road, and that's just 2 driveways down. And quite honestly, I volunteer at the fire department. Ryan Puller lives 2 doors up the other way. He volunteers at the fire department. Ben Story, he volunteers at the fire department. He's up at the same house as Ryan. Their son, Andrew, down the driveway behind me, is volunteer fire department. We're gonna know where Deep Creek is. When we respond, we get a text to our phone, and it gives, and when you tap on the map, it may not be clear when they're talking on the radio, but as you're getting your stuff and getting in your car, that text comes through, you tap on it, it gives you a map right where to go. My son's point, exactly, if it's a brand new road, even that's gonna struggle, so,
Okay, thank you.
do get directions.
Any questions for Mr. King? Would anyone else like to speak? Yes, sir.
So my name's Dale Story, I'm Caleb's uncle. I just want clarification, so is Crossing Brook and Cumberland Crossing, is the name Crossing Brook the name of the road?
No. Cumberland Crossing is not the name of the road. Crossing Brook is the name of the road. Cumberland Crossing.
But everyone refers to it as Cumberland Crossing. When it got dispatched, it got dispatched to Cumberland Crossing.
I don't know that. I don't know the answer.
That's how it got confused, I would
All
assume.
right, Mr. Story, if you could just direct your comments to us.
Yeah,
We
so
don't- we don't need
I'm
to-
just looking
yeah.
for
If you have a
clarification.
Okay, well,
So if it got dispatched as Cumberland Crossing versus Crossing Brook, someone either gave them, bad information and didn't give a street name that's not in the GPS systems.
but that could happen, right? I mean, people
Yeah, no,
give bad
absolutely.
information. Yeah.
The only reason I was asking if Cumberland Crossing was the name of the road is because that has been named since that Mr. Brushwein has been the addressing officer, but it's obviously not the name of the road. So I was just unclear of when the name of the road.
Okay.
So I don't know the name of the road, so.
Right. All right. Thank you for your comments. Would anyone else like to speak in favor of the appeal? Seeing no one, would anyone like to speak in opposition to the appeal? Seeing none, would anyone like to speak neither for nor against the appeal? If not, I will close the public portion of this hearing, and we will deliberate. What are people's thoughts on this appeal? Andrew, would you like to start?
Sure. First off, I think it was a very, very strong presentation by Mr. King there, and provided a lot of information, made some very persuasive arguments. I think one of the issues, though, that is sort of missing here, because we're looking at the names and, you know, the rhyming and all that. I have not worked as a 911 dispatcher, but I've made a few 911 calls, and I've also listened to a lot of 911 calls. And one of the problems is I think this issue was brought up, is that the callers are oftentimes confused, they're panicked, and so forth. And so they're not necessarily thinking. That's not often a problem when it's the person reciting their own address. It does become a problem, particularly with auto accidents that occur oftentimes where people don't know where they even are. And so they may just be saying the last road that they saw, maybe they can see part of the street sign from where they are, or something like that. And that's where you run into the instance where a single word can lead the 911 dispatcher astray. So, for instance, the example was put out there, okay, it's going to be either Woody Creek Lane or Deep Creek Drive. Well, someone who's been in an accident might have just, the only word they might have seen, and they might say, I'm at Creek Road. Okay, well, that's completely ambiguous. Now you don't know, where the person is, but you don't know, there are one of the two creek things, and you got to figure out which one it is. But if there's only one street in that town named Creek, you know where that's going to be, okay? And it gives you a much better idea. But that's when the 911 dispatcher is trying to figure out, where are you? And you have to identify, well, there's trees, I'm by some creek road, or whatever. That's where I think the confusion sets in. And for that reason, I would give an enormous amount of deference to both the police chief and the fire chief in this instance. I perfectly understand your interest in getting this named the same name as your company, basically. There's economic concerns there. I think we would try to make that happen as much as possible. But I got to say, I'm gonna lean toward the police chief and the fire chief in this instance, and their views on this.
Thank you, Andrew. Other comments?
I'd just like to comment, you know, I hear what you're saying, but, you know, when you look at the names, I mean, Deep Creek Drive, Woody Creek Lane, I'm looking at the different names in the town of Cumberland. And there are a lot of names that are a lot more similar than that, and we seem to be getting along just pretty well with that. As the text comes in with the GPS coordinates, nowadays, when you call 911, your phone auto-locates to them, to that point where you're calling from. So, I mean, there are lots of names that that should be changed before, I think, Deep Creek Drive and Woody Creek Lane is gonna be a problem. That's my interpretation of that, so.
Are you saying, Chris, that your recommendation would be the town look at this more holistically, basically, that this situation does not appear to be as bad as some other current situations, and maybe it's, I mean.
I think if you're looking at, Wood Circle, Woodlands Way, Woodside Drive, Woody Creek, I mean, there are lots, and then you look at, the Pines, Pine Lane, Pine Ridge, Pinewood, and then Mill Road, Mill Ridge Road, which there's also a Mill Road and a Mill Ridge Road in North Yarmouth, which my house guest used to go to before I moved from there. I mean, there's a lot of similarities, and that's a lot closer and a lot more troublesome than Deep Creek Drive.
The problem, though, is, I mean, I hear what you're saying, I'm struggling with this, but the problem is, just because there are other, maybe worse problems in town, is that a reason why we should just sort of not be as strict as as we otherwise would be? I guess I'm struggling with the notion that, I mean.
And I'm sure, I'm sorry.
Well, no, I just do, I feel that the use of the word creek, I don't think you can really look at the name, as Andrew was saying, I don't think you can really look at street, drive, lane, because people often just skip that, particularly if you're not familiar with it, right? You don't really know. I mean, I don't know what I'm on. I'm on something that could, that's something creek. And I guess the question is, and what I'm struggling with, is it really obvious that you're going to be on, Deep Creek as opposed to Woody Creek?
Well, I mean, and I understand what you're saying. I'm sure that if we dug into it, a lot of these similar sounding names were pre-1998 statute, and I'm sure there's reasons for that, and I'm sure that's why the state of Maine wants these statutes to try to eliminate this issue. But in this one, we've got Deep Creek Drive and Woody Creek Lane. There's two out of the three words are different, and even if you swallowed, the deep and all you heard was creek and drive, you still know it's not Creek Lane. So that's.
Well, I guess
my
to me it would be if you swallowed the wood part. Could somehow, if you swallowed the wood and didn't know if it was a drive or a street or whatever, so you're saying E Creek and
Lane.
Eep Creek, I think. And I'm not sure, frankly, that doesn't sound, I'm just trying to think of if what's a worst case scenario? Because really, we got to think of worst case scenario here, right? And that's what the ordinance is telling us to do, I think. And that's what the fire chief and the police chief are asking us to do, and Mr. Brushwein is. And I guess the question is, in a worst case scenario, could this be confused? So, other comments?
I guess, Mr. Chair, going to what Chris was saying, though, do we have a big issue with it now? We have lots of roads that are named similarly now. And I don't know whether there's a big issue. As Chris was pointing out, there's the forests, basically anything nature related, right? There's 3, 4, 5, 6 roads that are similar sounding. And when I first saw this, I had the same kind of reaction. Woody Creek Lane, Deep Creek Drive, those are sufficiently different in my mind. I do struggle with the fact that I'm not the one who has to respond. So I do that's the same struggle I think everybody's having is, I'm not the one who has to take the call. I'm not the one who has to drive and answer the call. So I do certainly think there should be a lot of deference there, but in my mind, they're sufficiently different in my mind. So that's kind of where I'm struggling. And I don't know, I guess we don't have the fire chief or the police chief with us to know whether they're having an issue now with the names that exist, but.
I think you can disallow lane, road, street, because.
But
a lot
disallow,
of
you mean
people
ignore?
Ignore,
Yeah.
because a lot of people don't know whether it's a road, street, or a lane, or, so when they're calling in, that's going to be confusing anyway. Middle road, middle lane, they don't know.
Yeah.
So what you have to look at really is the major words of that. And unless things have changed, cell phones don't automatically give the location when they call 911.
They do unless you've turned that function off, and
Right.
that may be even difficult to turn off.
Right, because it used to be a confusion, like somebody's in an accident and you can't track their cell phone.
You have to physically go in and turn that
Yeah,
function off.
yeah. So that's not always reliable when somebody calls 911.
Well, they're not necessarily always calling 911 from the location. You could be calling from another location
Right.
saying, I got a call from this location, excuse me.
Exactly.
Or some, so it might not, the fact that you could be traced where you're calling doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
No, that's not a reliable thing to be able to be traced by the caller. Because I've done both dispatch and responding. Long time ago for dispatch, and I only did it a short while. But when you're taking the calls, luckily Cumberland is not an extremely busy town, but it can get busy. And if you're taking a call and things are busy, it's really hard to get that address when somebody's calling. And they're panicked. They're confused, especially if it's a real emergency, a house on fire or something.
So let me just point out the standards here, and because I think it's important, because
Could I, let me,
oh, I'm
can I
sorry,
speak
Ron.
first?
Yeah, Mr. Kopp, go right ahead.
I think that since this came to light, I talked with one of the sergeants on the police force, Tom Bridges. I talked to one of the other officers. They told me that anytime they get a call, whether it's the fire department gets the call, the police are usually there first. But it comes right on their screen, on their computer screen, the map of the town and a red dot right where the call is coming from. Not by somebody's voice, it's where the call is coming from. And they know exactly where they're going. Everybody on the police department and everybody on the rescue in this town, being a small town, knows where Middle Road is and knows where Blanchard Road is, and they always give cross streets. I think Mr. King has done an excellent job on his homework on this. I think there are so many other streets that are worse than this one.
What about, Ron, what about the situation where somebody's calling for somebody else, or they've left the spot to get away or something like that, you know, from an abuse situation, and so they're...
Well,
you know,
that could happen. I receive calls all the time on the telephone for somebody that wants a wrecker. They don't know whether they're on 295 or 95.
Right.
One's the turnpike and one's 295, you know, but you have to keep questioning them. You really do. You got to lay it on the person that's making the call to get it right. Not with the police department or the responding fire department that's responding. You got to tell them or send where the wrecker's going.
Yeah.
But
I think also another question is, in the past with all of the other names that are so similar, that was prior to this process being in place. Do we start now following that process?
Well, that's kind of why I wanted to get back to what the standard is that we have to deal with here, right? The ordinance says what the requirement is, and we have to apply that. And in some ways, whether every single street in town, you know, has got another name just like it, in some ways that's not even, is not the legal standard here. It's not the standard that this board, which has to apply the law, has to look at. What we have to look at is, is the request, does it violate the standards of 246-4B? And I mean, I think that has to be the fundamental question. Obviously, there's a certain amount of practicality that we have to put into it, which we've talked about. But I think, you know, to me, the first question is, no street shall be given the same name. Okay, that's standard number one. Is it the same name if it's Woody Creek versus,
Deep Creek.
Deep Creek.
what is it?
Deep
Creek.
I think
Thank
when
you.
you've got three syllables in the name,
Yeah.
if it was Woody Drive or Woody Lane, that could be a problem.
So it's probably not the same name,
But when
right?
it's Woody Creek Drive, I don't think it's
So it's- yeah, so, I mean, I don't think it's the same name. I mean, I guess there's a certain point where, you know, the same, but I think you're right. So then number two is, no two streets shall have similar sounding names. And I guess, you know, or maybe it's a combination, but because creek is the same, and then is it similar sounding enough to be confusing? I mean, that's the standard we have to apply, and what we're hearing is that the police chief thinks that they are. And he does have the expertise here, and I don't. Although I will say that as a practical matter, I tend to agree with what Ron and Chris, what you guys are saying, which is they don't seem that similar to me. So I'm just struggling with the, you know, if our police chief, who is the guy who's in charge of the 911 calls around here, thinks that they're similar sounding, I struggle with that, and Andrew made some good points.
Although I will say that in his memo, he was incorrect in the name of the street.
Of the, calling it a drive versus, yeah, it would be helpful if he,
You know, Deep Creek Lane and Woody Creek Lane sound a lot
Much more similar.
than Deep Creek Drive and Woody Creek.
that is true. It would be helpful if he were here. Mr. Brushwein, did you have a conversation with him about that error in his memo? No.
It was the same error in the fire. I think the fire chief's memo also
They
made the
both,
same error,
they both made that error?
I believe, yeah.
So we don't really know what their true
That is a point of some significance, actually, yeah. Yeah, Mr. Black?
So, well, I will acknowledge this, that I think that there are far more egregious examples in the town than this particular one. I don't think anyone's debating that. But I do think that this is, that we should stop the bleeding in a sense, and I think really establish a standard. And Matt, just to your point there, it says no street shall be given the same name. I would actually say that this is the same name, or at least I think it can be reasonably interpreted as such. Certainly, if this was a creek road versus a creek lane, we would say
That would be
that's
the
the
same.
same.
Yeah.
Okay, and so by adding a word in front of it, woody versus deep, I understand it. Sure, it makes it more distinguishable, but you still have the word creek in there, and that's. I think what the police chief is saying is that carries a certain amount of weight and could lead to some confusion. Is it unlikely? Yeah, it's probably unlikely, and like Sally points out, that we don't get a lot of calls in this town. But I think that, Matt, you made the point, we're planning for the worst-case scenario. And I think that this is the prudent thing to do in this instance. So I guess I'm along those lines anyway, that I think we should uphold the decision of the assessor.
I'm really torn. I know on one side about the names of the streets and trying not to get them the same, but I also sympathize with wanting to have a name that means a lot to you. That, I really sympathize with that. I grew up in a place that was well-known, and if I had been able to name a private road, I would have wanted to name it that name also, the place that I grew up. So I understand that part of it. So, because of those two sides, I'm extremely torn.
I will say on that point, Sally, I get that as well, but, if somebody's last name is Blanchard, and so they want to, name their private drive, Blanchard Lane, I mean, you have to apply the ordinance, and
Sorry.
yeah, no, go ahead.
So Matt, just to go towards your point on the memos from the police chief and the fire chief, they're examining all three of the proposed names, and they're bringing up examples of Pine Ridge, Pinewood, Pine Lane being similar to Pine Brook. Okay, that I get, pine, 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 pine. So that's not really what we're talking about here. And then it seems to be the fire chief, at least, is coming down to Brook Road and Brookside Drive, I guess being overly similar to Pine Brook Road, which is the third proposed name. I don't think Brook Road and Brookside Drive are close to Deep Creek Drive. And then we're left with one, which is Woody Creek Drive. At least for the fire department's memo, and I think this police chief's memo is rather similar. They were asked to comment on all three proposed names.
Right. But neither memo, putting aside the others, the preferred one here, which is Deep Creek Lane, Deep Creek Drive, and they only talk about Woody Creek Drive, they never,
Which is actually incorrect, because it's Woody Creek Lane.
right.
So that's the only one that's actually applicable here in their list.
And it's the only one that's wrong.
And then it goes through, phonetic pronunciations, letter B, like the letter C. Woody Creek Lane and Deep Creek Drive. I mean, other than the word creek, there's not a lot of phonetic similarity there, deep and woody. I'm just going through his memo, because if we're gonna be deferential to the memo, then I think we have to examine that. And some of these I agree with. I agree that there are too many pine Pine this, Pine that. If it was Pine Brook Road, I'd be a lot more anxious to say no. It's too similar, but I think when we boil this down, it's between Deep Creek Drive and Deep Creek Drive, or in Woody Creek Drive, which we know is Woody Creek Lane. Woody Creek and Deep Creek, I think is the decision point.
You know, what's interesting, Chris, about the point here that we're saying that the fire chief and the police chief got the names wrong, it kind of cuts both ways, right?
I know.
I mean, if even they got the name wrong, you know that people, and they're looking at it for the purpose of the name, to figure out whether the name makes sense, they got it wrong in their memo, that does suggest that, you know, everybody's gonna get that part wrong, that, you know, or it's very easy to get that part wrong. So you really, as I think Sally was saying earlier, you almost have to just discount the, you know, what you call the street. Yeah, right, the nature of the street. But, and you have to look at the unique aspects of it, so.
Well, that's, yeah, I mean, that's if we're going through the criteria, the first criteria is no streets given the same name. The example is Pine Road and Pine Lane. So it's not like we're saying Deep Creek Drive and Deep Creek Lane. That's the example they've given. So then we're with the similar sounding names, Beach Street and Peach Street. Those are very, I mean, you can see how those are extremely similarly sounding, the same phonetic sounds to them. So that's Deep Creek and Woody. That's,
Yeah.
I'll stop there.
All right, well, I gotta say, I will just say I'm sympathetic to what Andrew is saying. I'm sympathetic to the police chief, but I do think, given the confusion here on the fire chief and the police chief, given that if you just look at Deep and Woody, I think they're sufficiently different, frankly, and I don't think that there could be a basis for confusion. I do think, however, that the town ought to consider these issues, consider all of the, frankly, you know, if we are to uphold this appeal and reverse the decision of the assessor here, it sort of ought to come with a recommendation that the town look at this more holistically, frankly, because there's a lot worse situations than this, and frankly, that could be problematic. So that's where I'm coming out, I think. Other comments?
I don't think we can look back at all. There are a lot worse situations in Cumberland, but you can't look back because you're never going to be able to rectify those. It just
Right.
would take too much.
Well, I mean, maybe, yeah, it is tough,
We have to
but,
look forward and
right. But I mean, I do think in this situation,
defend it.
I just think it's hard to confuse them. And ultimately, I have to rely on the ordinance language, and I just think as I look at the ordinance language, I really don't think that it meets those criteria. In other words, that I believe it is permissible under those criteria. So having said that, I would entertain a motion, if anyone wants to make one.
So we're making a motion to, voting to whether we are appealing, or we are granting the appeal or denying the appeal.
Yes, correct. So, right.
Can you speak up a little down there?
Sorry,
There you
Mr. Kopp. Then I will make a motion to grant the appeal, to reverse the decision on the denial of the proposed street name, Deep Creek Drive.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor of granting the appeal, raise your hand. 4, all those opposed? 2, 4 to 2. So the appeal is granted. And so, thank you, Mr. Brushwein, thank you, Mr. King, thank you everyone for your presentations. And I'll pass around a signature sheet to sign, which the appellant can pick up tomorrow, I suppose, right, in the office?
Close
No?
tomorrow.
Oh, we're closed tomorrow, right, it's Friday, right, next week then, okay. Sign that.
He has it.
He has the original.
I have the original here, which we can, yep. So, but we'll do that afterwards. Thank you, everyone. The next item of business is administrative matter. It's an approval of the minutes for the November 14, 2019 meeting. If anyone was here at that meeting, if you want to make a motion.
If I
we
could
approve.
suggest some amendments first.
Sure, yeah,
A
please.
couple quick things. Matt, I'm surprised you didn't pick this one up, though, but on the first page, there's a reference to Mr. Manahan disclosed about his lawn firm. I believe it's a law firm.
I was mowing my daughter's lawn this weekend, and I felt like I had a lawn firm.
And then on page 5 of that, there's a statement that says that it's in the 1, 2, 3, 5, I guess, paragraphs down. Paragraph starts, Mr. Black said the board, and in the third sentence, it says, Mr. Black said he thinks that the board's job is to make sure that impacts are increased. I think it should say are not increased.
Okay, right.
And with those two amendments, I would move to approve the minutes.
Christina, did you get those? Thank you for reading that so closely,
Yeah.
Andrew.
Second.
He's a
That makes
lawyer.
one of us. Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve the minutes as amended. All in favor, who are here, I guess? 5 in favor, maybe 1 abstention?
Yeah, one abstention.
Okay, well, maybe 2 abstentions, whatever. Okay, they're approved. So, any further business to come before the board tonight? If not, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn?
Second?
All in favor? We're adjourned and we can go off the air.